The views expressed on the following program do not necessarily reflect the views of Money Radio staff, management, or advertisers, and do not represent an offer to buy or sell any securities. Some interviews heard on this program may be sponsored by the participants. It's time for Health Futures with Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth. This is Arizona's only show dedicated to providing you with expert advice on how to live a longer, healthier, and happier life. To learn more, call 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Bob Roth.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you. And it must be Friday. And indeed it is. We're coming from you from the Scottsdale Air Park Money Radio Studios, 1510 AM, 105.3 FM, and the World Wide Web, moneyradio1510.com. If this is the first time you're tuning into our show is about how our older adult population can live a healthier, happier life. How do they do that? They do that by listening right here to Health Futures coming at you from Money Radio Studios. Today is December 23rd. And it is the day before Christmas Eve and Christmas weekend, and it is our second to last show for the year. And it is hard to believe that 22 is almost over and 23 is almost here. But we have extraordinary guests here on the show, and this is really meaningful to me because this is an organization that I've been connected to for over 20 years, and they do amazing work here in our community. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guests. On my left is the Executive Director for Duet Partners in Health and Aging, Ann Wheat, a longtime friend and now first-time guest at Health Futures. Welcome to the show, Ann.
Thank you, Bob. I'm so happy to be here.
It is so good to have you here. And just to my right is an old friend, a fellow board member at Duet, and he is also somebody that has utilized the services of Duet and has learned so much from the services that Duet has, and that is Gerald Wood. He's a family caregiver and a good friend. Gerald, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm so pleased to be here and also be here with Ann.
Well, it's great to be here together. And, you know, Ann, I want to kick things off because I've had Duet here on the show before. But for our listeners who may not know about Duet, can you share a little bit about Duet? You have an interesting history with Duet because you have served in many different capacities, and now you're the leader of this incredible social service organization here in our community.
Well, I would be delighted to share a little bit about this precious organization. Duet Partners in Health and Aging is a 501c3 nonprofit based in Phoenix, and primary service area is Maricopa County. Our vision is a community where every person ages with compassion, dignity, and hope. We were founded 41 years ago, and we provide our services really through 4 core service areas. We support homebound adults. These are individuals who typically are in their 80s or above. They have multiple chronic health conditions, and they have lost the ability to drive. And with the help of caring, background-checked volunteers, they're able to stay successfully in their homes. We support grandparents raising grandchildren, about 450 grandparents this year alone. And these are these are kinship families where, through usually traumatic circumstances, a grandparent steps in to take over the care of their grandchildren. We support family caregivers through a variety of services, from support groups to workshops to personalized guidance, and our Finding Meaning and Hope workshop series. And lastly, we have supported nurses to set up health and wellness programs through their congregations to support congregants in the surrounding community. And in all this time, in 41 years, all of our core services have been offered free of charge.
And your background's very interesting because you, like Gerald and I, have served on the board for this organization back a few years ago. And then you actually
Yes.
were helping one of the programs, the family caregiving program.
Yes, many years back, I served as a board member for 6 years. That's how I personally got to know this wonderful organization. I was working for City of Phoenix as a career,
I know you were.
and after I retired, I knew I had one more passion position in me that I really wanted to do, and that was going to be working again in the nonprofit sector, doing something very meaningful for myself. To me, I mean, but to help others. And at the time, I was about 8 years in on my own caregiving journey, helping to care for my sister, who had been diagnosed at age 50 with a rare form of dementia. So there was an opening for Director of Family Caregiver Services, and I applied, and that was where I entered the staff professional side with this organization. And I served in that position. It was very, very meaningful to me for about 4.5 years before promoting to executive director. So I've really gotten to see this organization from so many aspects, and I have gotten to know an amazing group of family caregivers along the way and traveled that journey with them.
And that's when you and I knew one another. And we got to see one another, and I really was drawn to you because of the work that you do with family caregivers. And this is a great thing that I think that really makes what you do personal, and it really is, it really fuels your passion to do what you do, is because you did share your story about your sister, but you have other family members that have dealt with dementia and Alzheimer's, and it is really something that has fueled your passion to really do the work that you do.
Most definitely. Before my sister passed, and her journey was about, again, she was young when she was diagnosed, so she lived about 12 years. But before she passed, my father had been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia. My mother then was diagnosed with advanced cancer, and then ultimately also developed Alzheimer's. So it was, for my family, it was a 14-year caregiving experience. And I came to know from getting to know so many other family caregivers that as difficult as this was for us, we were very blessed. We had family members who showed up to help. My parents had the resources for in-home care to help shore up our support. And I had learned so much along the way. And I would also add that I think it's one of the hallmarks of Duet. It's what makes our organization and our team, I think, so amazing, is that so many of them, in addition to their professional skills, like me, they have walked the walk. And so our mission really resonates very deeply with them. And I think that is an amazing combination.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And as we wind down this first segment, Gerald, your journey is very personal as well. And
Yes.
you were a family caregiver for your beloved wife for many years. I think you said about 11 years
Yes.
from diagnosis to her passing. And
Yes.
and Duet was a resource that you utilized. If you would mind, for about 30 seconds, 45 seconds, indulge us so that we can bridge this into our second segment.
Sure, I'll be glad to do that. I think the thing that comes to my mind is how an incident like dementia in your family changes your life so dramatically. And Duet's played a big role in, I guess, my well-being, because I discovered Duet at the Cabaret, one of your events. At the time, I was very actively involved in the Alzheimer's Association and other groups in town, and I was so impressed with the organization of Duet and the way they handled that cabaret. I didn't know who they were, but now there have been quite a few years that we've been involved together with our events and the board activity, and now the things that I'm doing for the Meaning and Hope Institute. And it's been very rewarding. It's changed my life, and I feel so blessed at this stage of my life to have gone through all of this that I've done with my wife, Linda, cared for her, did things I never knew I could do at home. And, a caregiver has to step to the plate,
Yeah,
learn some new skills.
absolutely. Absolutely. And, I want you to talk a little bit more about what you learned, because this Meaning and Hope Institute is something that is really, really cool, and it is something that is, as Ann has said, it is a movement, and it is really changing the way family caregiving is going to be done, especially for those that are dealing with dementia and Alzheimer's.
Yes, it is.
So we got a little Steely Dan taking us out in the first segment. I really appreciate James mixing up the tunes every once in a while. You've been listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth. I've got Duet, Partners of Health and Aging, in the studio. I've got Ann Wheat. She's the executive director. And I got my fellow board member and friend, Gerald Lloyd, here with me. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. My name is Bob Roth. I'm your host, and if you're just tuning in, I've got Duet, Partners in Health and Aging here in the studio. I got Ann Wheat, who's the executive director, and I got Gerald Lloyd, who is a fellow board member as well as a recipient of some of the great tools and services that this fine organization provides to our community. So when we left off in the first segment, we talked a little bit about, with Gerald, about his journey, and he talked about one of the big events, the Cabaret, where he got really connected to Duet, and he was connected to the Alzheimer's Association. He'd been connected to Banner, but really was looking, whether he knew it or not, was looking for resources and tools to be a better caregiver for his wife, his beloved wife, Linda. So, Gerald, I'd love to pick up a little bit more on that and talk about, what once you got connected to Duet, tell us a little bit about, the resources and the tools that you were given to really be that better caregiver for your wife.
Well, probably, that's a great question. Probably one of the most significant things that's happened in my later life is the understanding that I finally acquired through the Duet organization and their connection with Dr. Boss, Pauline Boss, and her wonderful book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. And I think that caregivers hit a point where they just run out of steam. I think that's the best way to express it. I've been caregiving for my wife for quite a long time and felt it wasn't a depression, but it was a feeling of loss, and I didn't realize that you could actually grieve someone who had not passed. It was a concept that would be foreign to me.
Right.
And I had read a lot of books, and we attended support groups together. My wife and I, when we came to Phoenix, to Banner Alzheimer's Institute, were hesitant to go to support groups. I don't know what our hesitancy was. I think we were always so self-reliant as a couple. Raised 3 boys, and everything just seemed to always fall into our laps because everything worked, and all of a sudden things weren't working. So we began to attend support groups, first with the Alzheimer's Association, and also Banner had support groups for us. But as that evolved, then with these various organizations, and Lynn and I also serving in the Regional Leadership Council at the Alzheimer's Association, Duet came on the scene. And they were a perfect fit for us, and I began to attend support groups with a Duet facilitator, which happened to be Ann Wheat sitting beside me. Ann was one of the most effective facilitators that we ever had. And I think that Duet's range of services always impressed me. I didn't know of any organization that dealt with grandparents, for example, and some of the support groups that I had attended would have grandparents there that were just between a rock and a hard place. They were caring for perhaps a spouse who had dementia, Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia. They were also caring for maybe young children that were their grandchildren. They were the most stressed people I've ever seen in my life. Many times, you may remember, I don't recall we had somebody like that in your support group, but I had it in 1 or 2 other support groups. And there was a little bit of crying at every session because they had so much stress that they had no way to get it out. But they had a support group there that understood and wanted to help them through this. But I think the whole experience requires a lot of adaptation. you can't let life go on as it had been. You have to kind of grow with the situation and realize that you have to learn some new skills, and you have to be kind of give up for yourself. You know, it's not all about me anymore.
Right. And I often hear people say that you got to meet that person where they are in their journey. You know, they can't come to where you are. You got to be where they are. You know,
That's a good point.
I would love, you know, Ann, to really pick up on something that I think you really benefited from, you and Linda did, and that is the power of support groups. Because a lot of people really think that they're the only ones going through this. You can never understand what I'm going through, right?
That is so true. I think for all of the services that we run for family caregivers, the support groups we consider the core of that support, because they can be part of that caregiver's roller coaster ride of a journey, which could last years, many years. And that is the place where they build, as Dr. Boss calls your family of your heart and mind. That support system of fellow travelers who also are experiencing what it means to be a family caregiver of a spouse who may never get better, who may have a progressive condition that only gets worse. And so being together within a support group on a regular basis is, I think, the single best decision a family caregiver can make. It gets them out of isolation. They have a support system that is always there for them. They learn a lot. And they're also held accountable by other caregivers who, if they start to just get a little too far down the why me, poor me path, will help bring them back and lift them up and remind them that they are resilient and that they can make changes that will help with not only being a better caregiver, but help them with their well-being and their health. So I would say that is, while we run a lot of very important support services, that really is the core.
Indeed. I mean, the fact is that, you know, what is shared in that group is protected in that group, and you can share those feelings and feel comfortable with sharing those feelings, and it resonates with others that are there, which is so important.
If I may, just to put this in perspective now, very quickly, Duet now runs about 26, I believe it is, sessions every month of support groups. And that is to meet the demand and the need. So we have 26 every month. And so there is something for sandwich caregivers, LGBTQ community, men's group, Alzheimer's groups, Parkinson's groups. There's a landing place for everyone. There's general support groups as well, all free of charge.
And you mentioned it early on, grandparents raising grandchildren. I mean, that is continuing to be a real challenge for our community, where grandparents are, you know, put in this position who raised their kids, like you, Gerald. You raised 3 boys. You and Linda did such a fantastic job in doing that.
They
and
turned out in spite of us.
Yeah.
but those grandchildren, I can't imagine doing that. I would step to the plate if something like that happened in our family, but it's such an unbelievable responsibility late in life.
It is. I mean, it's overwhelming.
It is, and the stories we hear of where so many of these grandparents are starting, living on fixed incomes. What a lot of people don't know is about 60% or more of the grandfamilies we serve receive no financial assistance from the government. They're informal families.
Wow.
They have to figure it all out. And so by us supporting them, helping them maybe even get some legal, formalize that relationship, can be a tremendous, tremendous help to them.
So you said at the beginning in the first segment that you guys are a 501c3, and here we are at the end of the year, and I'm going to make the appeal on behalf of Duet. If you go to duetaz.org, and that's DUETAZ.org, the donate button is at the very, very top. A lot of you who are listening are looking for meaningful 501c3s to support. I encourage you to check them out. Look at the website. I say we, I'm coming off the board after 6 years of being on it, but we are 100% dependent on grant dollars and philanthropy. So please keep Duet in mind. So as we wind down the second segment and the first half, I want to just give you some interesting stats for you to think about as we start our third segment. I'm going to lean a little bit on Gerald to really talk about some of his newfound inspiration and passions that he has discovered, but here's some stats. 1 in 9 Americans, 65 and older, suffers from Alzheimer's. 1 in 3 seniors die with Alzheimer's or another dementia. The majority of these dementia patients are cared for by 16 million family caregivers who are unsupported, suffer from poor health, emotional stress, depression, and other financial pressures. During 2020, more than 15 million caregivers of people with Alzheimer's or other dementias provided an estimated 18.5 billion with a B hours of unpaid care, a contribution to the nation valued at $257 billion. And this stat, by 2050, the cost of dementia care is projected to reach $1.1 trillion. Arizona is the greatest need. They rank first in the nation for dementia cases, with a projected increase of 33% between 2020 and 2025. You're listening to Health Futures Taking Stock in You. It's halftime here at Health Futures. I got Duet Partners in Health and Aging in the studio. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures Taking Stock in You. I'm your host, Bob Roth, and we're in our second half here. If you're just tuning in, we have got Duet Partners in Health and Aging in the studio. I've got Ann Wheat, who's the executive director. I've got Gerald Lloyd, who is the family caregiver, care recipient of all these great tools that you guys have at Duet. And I do want to say, if you missed the first half, you missed really a special half. And if you want to go up to our website, go to cypresshomecare.com, click on the media button, and the radio show is right below that. You'll catch this show and many, many more. So, Gerald, I would love, you were sharing at the break a little bit about your relationship with your wife. And
Yes.
you guys were married for 56
years.
56 years.
Right.
And you worked together.
We did. We both met at Hallmark Cards in Kansas City.
And that's where they're based, right?
That's their home base.
Did you write those cards?
No, everybody asked me that, or did I have some artistic part of that?
Yeah.
No, I was trained in college as an industrial designer, so I began with Hallmark as a package designer.
Wow.
I was one of the first 3 they ever hired. Of course, that department grew later quite a lot, but then I advanced and was promoted to manager of their merchandise display department, and that was industrial design. So that was my career, and I became a member of the Industrial Designer Society of America. But Lynn and I met there, and then we made a decision to make a change and leave the corporation and all the comforts and the benefits and the future pension of a corporation to try it on our own. I guess we had a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit. And she was very supportive of me wanting to do that. The reason we chose a Hallmark store to go into is because at the time I was the national store operations manager for Hallmark Cards, and I managed Hallmark corporate-owned stores throughout the nation.
Right.
So I had a lot of practice and experience.
Exactly.
And so we tried that, and we opened a Gold Crown store in Tucson in a regional mall, and that was our family business. But we never had we were just talking about that at break, we never had a fuss in 10 years of working side by side. And I've talked to other couples that were in business together, and they had disagreements and problems and some fusses. But I think we were really fortunate to be that compatible. The key for us was division of labor. She took care of the front end, I took care of the back end. And also back in those days, we had outside warehousing, and I would shuttle merchandise back and forth to the store. I also did the payables at home. We didn't have software for payroll or bill paying or anything like that. But
right.
we just took that in stride. That's the way it was back then. We didn't have the technology we have today. But she was always a partner, and so when she got Alzheimer's, it changed everything, and we just shifted gears. But something I would like to say while I have the opportunity on the show to the listeners out there is that so many things you hear about dementia is so negative, and it is tough. It's one of the toughest things I ever did in my life, but it did change my life, and I think there's a flip side of that coin, and I think a lot of people who shift gears and begin to do caregiving for someone else, it's giving up of yourself a little bit, but there is also growth in that process. And I am so different today. Anybody who knew me back then or back when sees a different person. And I would like to think it's been a growth situation that I like myself better. And also my priorities have changed. It's more of a giving back type person instead of one that's all me and so forward focused on being successful in business.
Well, I imagine you also have a lot more patience than you used to have too,
Yeah,
because that is a virtue you really need when you're dealing with a loved one. That is
one of the things that happened in one of my first support groups. At that time, it was sponsored by the Alzheimer's Association at one of the senior centers. Is that a light bulb went on for me in that meeting, and that was that nothing about this dementia situation or Alzheimer's is normal. You don't deal with it normally. All your responses have to be different, so you modify your behavior a lot. And it's a difficult thing to do because you just don't change like you're switching off a light off and on. And so once you figure it out that you have to respond differently, you're more successful and you have less conflict. But a person with dementia, in the case of my wife, they get frustrated. Sometimes they're difficult to deal with. They're not themselves. They're an entirely different person because the dementia is affecting their mind.
no doubt.
It's quite a situation. It's quite a situation.
Well, first of all, our listeners are not seeing Gerald and Ann here today, but Gerald, you are, whether you know it or not, a super ager.
Oh, thank you.
You shared with me that you're going to be celebrating 85 years very soon, and
Yes, about another month.
And the way you move and the way you think and how articulate you are, and I know that you're very active. God bless you. You're doing things really well. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, to listeners, I would like to offer this. Once you go through the dementia thing, it's all. It doesn't end well normally. We know where it's going,
Right.
and that's part of the difficulty, because there's going to be a loss somewhere along the way. But I think it's so important, and I learned this from Dr. Boss in reading her book. You have to reinvent yourself somewhere along the line. And you have to find new interest. You can't be isolated. You can't grieve yourself to death. You have to get busy. You have to get up and you have to motivate yourself. What happened with me, because I had an art background before I went to work for Hallmark, is I took a class when Linda went into a care community, because I had the time then, and it was a painting class at the Scottsdale Artist School. It changed my life. As a matter of fact, Ann sitting here bought my first painting. I brought an art show to a support group and put 6 or 8 paintings up against the wall, and everybody in the support group looked at the paintings and they said they liked them, and Ann rather said, "I'll take that one." I didn't even know what to charge her for it. I charged her too little. The price has gone up, Ann.
Yeah, he's getting better too.
I
at
bought
it.
it because it was a great painting.
It's one of my best. It was my first, so it's kind of like a special painting to me too.
And what kind of painting are you doing?
I
Oil or water?
I do abstract acrylics. I've done some oils, but I will enter my 5th show at Mayo Clinic in 2023 because they like my work. Their committee passed on my work, and I've had 4 shows rather, with multiple paintings. Ann's was borrowed for one of the shows. She was kind enough to give it up for 3 months. And so it's given me a boost in life. It's like a new lease on life at a late stage.
Did you always have that in you? And did this, work that you did, and it's the work on yourself that you did with Dr. Boss, did that help bring that out?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I just felt that when she said you grieve before they pass, a lot of that grieving was done before Linda passed, at least 2.5 years. And it's when you grieve. Then when she passes, it doesn't hit you quite as hard. My most grief was within the immediate days of her passing. But since that time, I've connected with people through my art. through receptions, showing my work in various galleries. And then I began, one of the things I missed earlier in our conversations is that one of the things I did that helped me a lot deal with my caregiving, I did as kind of a form of a cathartic thing. I began to write. One morning I was having coffee, she was sleeping, and I began to, I can never talk about this without breaking
it's
down.
okay. No, it's all right.
But I wrote a caregiver's prayer.
I
And
know.
I started writing. Now I'm writing for the Meaning and Hope Institute. 22 stories have been submitted and accepted, and 10 sonnets. So it
Wow, love
kicked
it.
something off in me that I didn't know I had. All my writing experience before had been technical in nature with my companies I worked for, but then I learned I could write prose, I could write poetry, and it's amazing what writing does to get out what's inside and on paper. As long as you're not embarrassed what you're putting on paper,
Right.
you need to be pretty honest. And
Right. No, I absolutely, and I so appreciate you sharing that with us. And you talked about the grieving piece, and as we wind down this third segment, and I want our listeners to know that our fourth segment, we're going to talk about Dr. Boss and Meaning Hope Institute, and it's really important because it has really been helpful to you and so many others. But as we close this one, and I'm dealing with some grief as well, having lost my dad. Did you feel a sense of relief when Linda passed?
that's a tough question because there's a sense of guilt if you say that.
Right, there is, no doubt.
The
But
pressure on a caregiver that's probably a good thing for even listeners to know. You shouldn't feel guilty about being relieved because I've
Right.
heard this in support group from others. It's a natural instinct that you let down. Look what Ann went through with her parents. There had to be a sense of relief somewhere along the line because she was so involved for so long that it changed her life. She had to give up a lot of her life for them.
right, and I've been listening to a podcast where I've really heard and learned a lot about that. Well, with that, we're down 3 segments. We got one more to go. We got Duet, Partners in Health and Aging in the studio. Stick around. We got one more left. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
The Health Futures, taking stock in you. I'm your host, Bob Roth. And if you're just tuning in, I've got Duet, Partners in Health and Aging here in the studio. I've got Ann Wheat. She's the executive director. I've got Gerald Wood, who is a fellow board member and a recipient of some of the great services that Duet does provide for our community. And when we just wrapped up our third segment, I was talking with Gerald and was talking about, did you feel a sense of relief? And I was referencing this podcast, and I'm not here to promote someone else's podcast, but many of you guys know who Anderson Cooper is. He is on CNN every single day, but he did a podcast when he lost his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, and he did a podcast called All There Is. And there's like 8 episodes, and there are some really famous people that were on talking about grieving and loss. And one was Louis Armstrong's wife, who talked about how she felt a sense of relief and felt guilty for feeling that. And then when she dug deeper, she understood that that relief was not just for her, but it was really for Louis and what he was going through. So many of you are listening have been in that role as a family caregiver, or you know someone that's been in that role. As we sit here and wind out our end of year, I want you all to be mindful of those family caregivers out there. Think about them, but also don't ask to help them out. Go shopping for them. I always say this on the show: if you're making a casserole or dinner, make 2 and drop 1 off.
Excellent.
Because they need the support. They need the help. Many of them are of Gerald's generation, who took that vow of sickness and health literally, and I don't need your help. I've got this. This is my responsibility. We get that, but do accept that help, because you can't take this journey alone.
You cannot do it alone. No,
It really is hard. So it's a great segue to talk about Pauline Boss, Dr. Boss, and this Meaning and Hope Institute. So I'm going to punt it over to you, and using football metaphors, right? So, Ann, please tell us a little bit about Dr. Pauline Boss, the Meaning and Hope Institute and what that really means, not only for our community, but communities worldwide.
I would be so pleased to do that. And I'm going to wind back the clock about 6.5 years when I was first introduced to Dr. Pauline Boss's book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, How to Find Hope While Coping with Stress and Grief. At the time, as Director of Family Caregiver Services for Duet, I was running support groups, including 2 for family caregivers of persons with Alzheimer's and related dementia. And one of the caregivers in the group called me one day and said, I'd like to come in to the office. There's a book that I think was so powerful to me and would mean so much to the caregivers in our group. She brought Dr. Boss's book in. That was the first I'd heard of it. I went home and read it, and I can only say that at the time my sister was still alive, so I was not familiar with Dr. Boss's work. But when I read Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, it really was like a tectonic shift in my thinking. And a hole was filled, and this aha moment of, so that is what's going on with me. That is why I feel so sad. And the good news is I could do something about it. There's resiliency-based strategies to navigate this ambiguous loss. So following that, we ran a book club just to see how the caregivers would respond to her book. And they took the deepest dive, and it was powerful. From there, we thought, how do we reach more caregivers with this? Dr. Boss is a national treasure in the world of family caregiving. And to give you a little background, for 45 years, her life's work has been studying grief, and she actually identified a complex grief and named it ambiguous loss back in the 70s. In the context of caring for someone with dementia and a caregiver, that is when you grieve for someone because they're physically present but psychologically absent or missing or no longer who they used to be in profound ways. And so the basis for her work, ambiguous loss, will resonate with a lot of people when they hear that, is that caregivers of persons with dementia, by and large, while they're often diagnosed as having depression, she contends that it's actually chronic, deep sorrow and sadness, this different form of grief that goes unacknowledged, unrecognized, and unsupported. And that ambiguous loss causes the most significant amount of their stress, more than the heavy workload and the caring, that takes their health down. And the crux of all this, that's the good news, is that while some dementia family caregivers do have depression, she contends that that's pathologizing them. And they are then put on medications or therapy. The cure or the antidote for deep sadness is community. It's resiliency-based techniques for moving forward. And that is what she teaches. Ambiguous loss isn't something that requires medication. So caregivers, what we did was we then took it to the next level, contacted Dr. Boss. She agreed to take a chance with this little nonprofit out west and came out, and we got money from the Virginia G. Piper Charitable Trust to be able to film her with real-life dementia family caregivers in groups of 5, and each day do a videotape where she imparts the lessons from her book. And we created a video discussion series that is much like a really ramped-up book club. And it has taken off.
Wow.
We have probably served well over 800 family caregivers.
Nice.
We did it locally, then at a state level, then we got a national grant to roll it out. That we're 1 year in, but we intend to take this and make it available to caregivers everywhere by training volunteer facilitators.
So if our listeners, and gosh, I could do a whole show on Dr. Boss and the work that she's doing. If our listeners want to learn more about the Meaning and Hope Institute and some of the offerings that Dr. Boss has, how do they find that?
So we created the Meaning and Hope Institute as a virtual community of care and support. And they can get on that website or go through duetaz.org, look up Dementia Family Caregiving, and they will find the link there, or just go straight to the meaningandhope.org.
Yep.
And they can find out more. We train facilitators to take this out to their communities to help caregivers, and it's always free of charge.
And we want you to know, the listener, and if it's not you, someone that you know that might be going through this journey, that you're not alone, that we have resources and tools for you. And certainly we're here talking about Duet, but there are other organizations like the Alzheimer's Association and others. But Dr. Boss, her programs have had stickiness, and they work. And Gerald Wood is a great example of what she has done for you. And she's had you come out of your shell and taught you things that you never knew you had in you in terms of writing and art and really finding meaning and hope through this journey that you were going through with Linda.
And I would just like to say, for any caregiver that is hearing this that may consider this, or if you know someone who might, it is the most important step to take. In our national pilot, 100% of the family caregivers who participated, either in person or virtually, in finding meaning and hope, said that it lowered their stress. They all benefited.
So without further ado, I'm going to give you a plug. duetaz.org. End of year. If you are looking to make a donation to a meaningful cause, hit that donate button. Help us support these volunteers and help us get the messages and the tools and the programming out to our community. And I can't thank you enough for coming into the studio. Gerald Wood, great to see you, buddy. I've learned so much more about you. Make it a great day. Have a great weekend. We'll be back next Friday.
There's no place like home. You've been listening to Bob Roth's Health Futures. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call Cypress Home Care Solutions at 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Or visit cypresshomecare.com. Be sure to join Health Futures with Bob Roth every Friday at noon, right here on Money Radio 1510 and 105.3 FM.